I should tell you before I begin that I was there for all of it. I am not the Duke of Strathvane. I am his younger brother, Lord Callum Ashvane, and I have watched my brother navigate 37 years of this world with the particular grimness of a man who expects nothing good from it, and is, on most occasions, proven correct. I loved him for it, in the way you love a person whose faults have become so familiar they feel like furniture. He was cold, he was precise, and he was, in the matter of marriage, absolutely and catastrophically wrong about everything, until a jilted woman arrived at our grandmother's house in the second week of November and refused to be impressed by him. I was staying at Strathvane Hall that autumn because I had nowhere else to be, and because our grandmother, Lady Elspeth Ashvane, had written to me in terms that brooked no argument. "Come," she had written, in her particular economical hand. "Your brother is being an idiot about the Colville girl, and I may need a witness." I had folded the letter, packed my trunk, and come. The hall stood in the Strathvane Valley, gray and massive and certain of itself, the way all things that have endured several centuries tend to be. November had stripped the beeches to their bones. The loch beyond the east lawns had gone the color of pewter. My brother, the Duke of Strathvane, stood at the library window when I arrived and told me, without turning around, that he had no intention of meeting the woman. "You'll meet her," I said, dropping into the nearest chair. "Grandmother has already written to her." "Then grandmother can receive her." "Grandmother is 81 and has a bad hip and will contrive to be indisposed the moment the carriage arrives, leaving you no choice." I paused. "You know this, I know this. She knows we know this. It is the established pattern." My brother turned from the window. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, with the kind of face that shut doors before he'd opened his mouth. Dark brows, a jaw cut for severity, eyes the color of the loch in November. Women found him handsome, which he regarded as an administrative inconvenience. What women actually found in him, I had always thought, was not precisely handsomeness, but the quality of self-containment taken to its furthest possible degree. A man so thoroughly buttoned against the world that the very fact of the buttoning communicated something, some deep-seated conviction that the world was not to be trusted with anything vital. He had been engaged once 8 years ago. She had been beautiful, well-connected, and had found in the second year of the engagement that the weight of his reserve was too great to live under. I had not blamed her. He had not blamed her either, which was somehow worse. He had accepted it as confirmation of a thesis he had apparently been building his whole life. "She was left at the altar," he said now, "by Penderton of all men. A man whose principal distinction in life is his horses." "Yes." "Her father went bankrupt 6 months ago. The Colville solicitor practice gone. She has no portion, no prospects, and apparently no pride, or she wouldn't be allowing grandmother to maneuver her into this." I looked at him for a long moment. "You haven't met her." "I don't need to." "That," I said, "is precisely what grandmother is counting on." He made a sound low in his throat and turned back to the window. Outside, the first carriage lamp was visible at the far end of the drive. I went downstairs to meet her. She stepped out of the carriage onto the gravel of Strathvane with no particular ceremony. She was perhaps 25, slight, with dark hair dressed simply against the cold, no ringlets, no ornament, just a plain knot at the nape of her neck under a bonnet that had seen better seasons. Her coat was good but not new. She did not look up at the hall the way people usually did, with that involuntary tipping back of the head as the scale of the place registered. She looked at the front door, assessed the distance between herself and it, and walked. I met her on the steps. "Miss Colville, I'm Lord Callum Ashvane." "Lord Callum." She had a clear, steady gaze and a handshake that was, by the standards of the day, rather more direct than convention required. Lady Elspeth was kind enough to write. "She's resting at present," I said, which was true in the sense that our grandmother was resting in her chair by the upstairs fire, listening for my brother's footfall on the stairs and timing everything accordingly. "Shall I show you to the drawing room?" Thank you. She walked through the entrance hall without gawking. The entrance hall of Strathvane is designed, in the way of all such entrance halls, to induce a certain smallness in the visitor, the vaulted ceiling, the double staircase, the portraits ranked like a tribunal along the upper gallery. She glanced at the portraits with the look of someone cataloging information rather than being intimidated by it. And then she looked at the fire that had been laid in the great hearth, and I saw her relax, very slightly, as people do when they are cold and find warmth. It's a very beautiful house, she said, and there was no performance in it. She meant the fire. My brother appeared at the top of the staircase. He had clearly intended to walk past, toward the east wing, and been intercepted by some internal calculation he hadn't fully finished making. He stood on the upper landing for a moment. He could see her from there. She could not yet see him, and then he came down. I watched Miss Colville notice him. Not the way women usually noticed my brother, which was with a kind of arrested attention, a held breath. She simply looked up, registered that a man was descending the staircase, and waited with the patient expression of someone who has learned that powerful men sometimes require a moment to arrange themselves before speaking. Miss Colville, he said, reaching the bottom step, I am Strathvane. Your Grace. The curtsy was perfectly correct, unelaborate. He waited, I think, for some sign of nervousness. He had an effect on people, and he was accustomed to it, and I believe he calibrated his own conduct partly in response to how people reacted to it. Miss Colville did not appear to be calibrating anything. She had looked at him, assessed him with the same quiet efficiency with which she had assessed the front door, and was now simply waiting to see what happened next. You had a comfortable journey, he said. Adequate, Your Grace. The road from the pass is rough in November, but the carriage was well sprung. A pause. My grandmother will receive you before dinner. She was kind enough to say so in her letter, a beat. I hope she is well. She is, he said, in the tone of a man who knows perfectly well his grandmother is not resting at all. Quite well. He inclined his head and walked toward the east wing. Miss Colville watched him go with an expression I could not entirely read, not disdain, not disappointment, something more like mild curiosity, the look of a person who has been given a puzzle she hasn't yet decided whether to bother solving. Well, I said. He doesn't want me here, she said pleasantly. Not as a complaint, as an observation, offered the way one might note that the road was rough or the fire was warm. He doesn't know what he wants, I said, which was truer than anything else I might have offered. She turned and looked at me, and for the first time I saw something in her face that wasn't composure, a flicker of something wry and a little tired. Lord Callum, she said, I have been told what I am and am not worth by a series of men who made it very clear they considered the assessment definitive. I am not here to dispute it. I am here because Lady Elspeth wrote to me with such particular kindness after my father's difficulties, and because I thought it might be unkind to refuse an old woman's company in November. She paused. I have no expectation of the Duke of Strathvane whatsoever. You may set your mind at rest. I did not, in fact, set my mind at rest, but I showed her to the drawing-room. Our grandmother descended at 5:30, moving with the deliberate, unhurried pace of a woman who has long since concluded that the world can wait for her, and she took Miss Colville's hands in both of hers and held them for a moment before she said a word. You look tired, she said. A little, Miss Colville said. Good, tired is honest. Sit down. Lady Elspeth Ashvane was not a soft woman. She had been the wife of the old Duke for 43 years, had raised my brother largely alone after our parents died, and had arrived at 81 with opinions that had shed all unnecessary softening along the way. She loved precisely whom she chose and made no pretense of feeling otherwise, and I had watched her, over the years, apply this quality like a scalpel to a great many people who presented surfaces they considered impenetrable. She had no patience for performance, no tolerance for flattery, and a memory for what people revealed when they thought they weren't being observed that I considered one of the more useful and dangerous qualities a person could possess. She looked at Miss Colville across the firelight with the expression of a woman reviewing her own prior conclusions and finding them confirmed. "Your father's situation," she said, "is it quite settled?" "As settled as it can be. There are debts, they are being managed. My brother has a position in a counting house in Edinburgh, and there has been a proposal of a post as a music teacher in Carlisle." A small pause. "I am considering it." "You will not be going to Carlisle," my grandmother said, with a serenity that suggested this was already decided. Miss Colville looked at her. "Lady Elspeth, we will discuss it after dinner. Do you play?" "Piano, yes. Not well enough for concert, well enough to be useful." "Useful?" My grandmother seemed to taste the word. "Come and play something." She played for 40 minutes before dinner. Not the decorative pieces that young women played to demonstrate accomplishment, but the sort of music that has weather in it, a Schubert impromptu, a Clementi sonata taken at a tempo that suggested she had stopped performing it and was simply inside it. She played with her back to the room and forgot, I think, that she was in anyone's house. Her shoulders, which had been held with the careful uprightness of a woman on uncertain social ground, eased within the first few bars. Her head inclined slightly to the left, as though listening to something the rest of the room couldn't hear. The sound she drew from the instrument was not polished in the way of women trained to impress. It was something rawer than that, something that had been learned in private and kept there, brought out now because she had been asked and did not know how to play by halves. My brother came in at minute 20. I don't think he meant to. I think he heard the music from the corridor and walked toward it without fully intending to, the way you walk toward a sound that resolves into something unexpected before you've had time to form an opinion about it. He stood in the doorway for several bars, and then he came fully into the room and sat in the chair nearest the window, which put him outside her line of sight, and he listened. He said nothing when she finished. She turned from the instrument, found us, and did not appear surprised to see him. "Forgive me," she said. "I lose track of myself at the piano." "Don't apologize," my grandmother said. My brother said, "The Clementi, the third sonata." "Yes, Your Grace. You altered the tempo in the third movement." She considered this. "I did. I find the marked tempo makes it sound as though the passage is trying to demonstrate its own difficulty rather than simply moving forward. It seems false to me, like a person clearing their throat before every sentence to remind you they are saying something important." A silence. The description had surprised him. I could tell by the slight pause before he spoke again, the narrowing of attention. He said, and that was all, but he was looking at her with an expression I recognized from his boyhood. The particular alertness of a mind that has encountered something it wasn't expecting and hasn't yet finished examining. My grandmother met my eyes across the room and said nothing. Dinner was the first test. Strathvane at dinner was a formal affair even when the household was small. The long table in the oak-paneled room, the candlelight, the particular silence of a house that has hosted centuries of meals and absorbed all of them into its walls. My brother sat at the head, my grandmother to his right, Miss Colville across from me, which placed her in my brother's direct line of sight, a positioning I recognized as deliberate. She did not make conversation for the sake of it. That was the first thing I noticed. Most people at that table in her position would have performed some version of effort, asked questions designed to flatter, made observations pitched to generate approval. She asked my grandmother about the history of the valley, listened to the answer with genuine attention, and then addressed a question about the lock to my brother, whether the ice was reliable in a hard winter, whether the eastern end froze before the western. He answered before he knew he was answering. The eastern arm, yes, it freezes from the shore outward, usually by the second week of December if the cold holds. The western end stays open longer. There are springs beneath the bed that keep the temperature up. Then the skating is on the eastern arm. When it's safe, yes. My brother used to test the ice, she said. He had a method, a long pole and a stone thrown out ahead. If the stone broke through and the water came up, you stayed back. If the ice held the stone, you tested the next foot. A pause. He broke through twice anyway. He was 8 both times. My brother looked at her. That sounds about right for 8. It does. A small smile, the first I'd seen. He was not a boy who learned from a single repetition. Something almost happened in my brother's face. Not quite a smile. He had not smiled at dinner in so long that the muscles involved seemed to have forgotten the sequence, but a movement, a loosening around the eyes. My grandmother, watching, touched her wine glass but did not lift it. After dinner he excused himself early, which was usual. Miss Colville helped my grandmother from the table, which was not usual. No one helped my grandmother, who considered assistance an implication of weakness, and yet my grandmother accepted it, which told me something. They walked together to the fire, and I heard my grandmother begin to ask about Carlyle and the Music Post, and I pretended to read the evening papers and heard none of it on purpose. I found my brother in the library at 10 o'clock, standing at the mantel with a glass of brandy he had apparently not touched. "Well," I said, "she's not what I expected." "What did you expect?" He set down the untouched glass. "Someone performing distress," he said. "Someone making the best of a bad situation in a way that required observation. Someone," he stopped. "Someone who wanted something from you," I said. A long pause. "Yes." "She doesn't," I said. "She genuinely doesn't. She's here because she was kind to grandmother in a letter and didn't want to retract the kindness in person." I paused. "That's rare, you know, in this house, in this county. People come here wanting things." He picked up the brandy and turned it in his fingers. "Carlyle," he said. "She's considering a post teaching music. Children of tradesmen, that sort of thing." "In Carlyle?" "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. "She altered the tempo," he said at last, in the tone of a man who is noting a fact and hoping not to be asked what it signifies. I said good night and went to bed. The days accumulated the way days do at Strathvane in November, long, gray, with the light coming in low off the hills and the valley filling with mist by afternoon. My grandmother managed things with her usual invisible authority. There were shared breakfasts. There were walks, my grandmother would announce, with the apparent spontaneity of someone who had been planning it for a week, that the walled garden or the east lawns or the path around the loch required inspection, and she and Miss Colville would set out, and my brother, who had appointments or correspondence or any number of other things, would somehow end up walking with them. I watched him try to remain at a distance and fail. The thing about Miss Colville was that she did not pull. Other women pulled toward him, toward approval, toward the space he occupied. She moved through the days at Strathvane with an attentiveness that was not directed at him. She noticed the walled garden's espaliered pears and asked the head gardener about the training method, and she listened to his answer with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, not performed interest but the real article, the kind that causes a person to remember what they've been told and ask a follow-up question 3 days later. She sat with the gamekeeper's wife, who had a sick child, and brought broth from the kitchen and stayed an hour. She read in the evenings her own books, brought in her trunk, not decorative volumes taken from the hall's shelves, and when she read she was entirely elsewhere. My brother watched her the way the loch watched the hills, still, waiting for something he couldn't name. On the third morning I came down to find her already at the breakfast table, working through what appeared to be a letter of some length. The ink on the page suggested she had been at it for some time. When she heard me, she folded it with a composure that was not self-conscious but simply contained, and said good morning, and asked whether the coffee was good. I said it was very good and sat down and looked at the folded letter. "From Edinburgh," I said. My brother. She took the coffee and wrapped her hands around the cup. He writes to tell me the position in Carlisle is confirmed if I want it. They would need me by January. And do you want it? She looked at the cup for a long moment. I think, she said, that it is a very sensible position and that I would do it adequately and that it would be a reasonable life. She paused. That is not quite the same as wanting it. I said nothing. I was going to be a solicitor's wife, she said, with the mild tone of someone recounting someone else's life. I know it does not sound a great ambition, but I had been fond of the household we were building, the small, ordinary structure of it. I had been fond of thinking I knew what the next 10 years would look like. She looked out the window at the gray morning. I am not sure I know how to want things in any particular direction anymore. The direction I had pointed myself in for a long time has been closed. She said it without self-pity, which made it worse. I refilled her coffee without being asked. She looked at me. I am not asking for sympathy, she said. I know, I said. I'm refilling your coffee because you were up early writing letters and your cup was empty. A pause. Then something in her face shifted, not a smile, but the precursor to one, the moment before a person decides whether to permit themselves the thing. She permitted it. Thank you, she said. My brother watched her the way he watched the lock, and the lock gave nothing back, and I do not think he knew what to do about a person who was not performing anything at all. On the fourth morning she rose before the household. I know because I am an unreliable sleeper, and I heard her pass my door in the dark. I looked out my window and saw her cross the east lawn in the pre-dawn gray, moving toward the lock with her coat wrapped around her and a small lantern in her hand. I didn't follow. I watched from the window as she found the bench at the lock's edge and sat, lantern at her feet, and simply looked at the water. She sat there for an hour before the house began to wake. I thought about what she had said to me on the first day. I am not here to dispute it. She had been told what she was worth, precisely and repeatedly, and she had stopped arguing with the assessment, not because she believed it but because she had found, somewhere in the months between being left at an altar and arriving at Strathvane, that her own company was sufficient. She had not recovered from what had happened to her. She was carrying it, the way you carry a stone you've grown used to, the weight absorbed into your gait until you forget you are walking differently. I told none of this to my brother. It was not mine to tell. That evening at dinner, she mentioned that she had been out at the lock in the morning. She said it in passing, as one notes the weather. My brother looked up from his plate, before dawn. I find it useful to sit somewhere that is not indoors when I cannot sleep, she said. The valley is very quiet at that hour. It is, he said. He paused. The lock's color changes before the light comes. It goes from black to something I've never known what to call it, dark silver, like tarnished plate. She considered this. Yes, she said, that is exactly it. She looked at him with a brief directness that he seemed not to know what to do with. You watch it too, then? Sometimes. In the mornings. When I cannot sleep, he said, and then looked down at his plate in the manner of a man who has accidentally answered a more honest question than the one he meant to. My grandmother refilled her own wine glass with the serenity of a woman who is listening to everything and watching nothing. It was on the 6th day that the ice broke. We had had 4 days of hard frost. The eastern arm of the lock had locked over. I had seen it from the library window, the surface going from gray and glinting to opaque white. My brother had walked the bank the previous morning, testing edges with his boot, and said nothing encouraging about its thickness, but it was the kind of ice that looked solid, which is precisely what makes it dangerous. The Mackinnon children, tenant family on the eastern edge of the estate, had been skating on it all morning. 3 of them, the eldest perhaps 10, the youngest perhaps 6. We heard them from the house, the scrape and shout of it, and no one thought to intervene because the eastern arm had held children's weight for years. At 11:30 the sound changed. I was in the hall when Miss Colville came through the front door at something close to a run, which I had not thought her capable of. She moved at that pace the way a person moves when they have already made the decision, and their body is simply executing it. "The small one is in," she said, and was gone back out the door before I had fully processed the words. I followed. My brother, who had been crossing the upper landing, came down the stairs at speed and was behind me. The youngest child, the girl, perhaps 6, had gone through a thin patch near the willow on the north bank. She was in up to her chest, her hands flat on the ice's edge, which was crumbling under the pressure. The 2 older children were on the bank, frozen with a panic that was entirely appropriate to their ages, which is to say they were doing nothing because they did not know how to do anything. Miss Colville was already lying flat on the ice, distributing her weight, 6 feet from the child, sliding forward. She had taken off her coat and was holding it out by one sleeve. "Take the end," she was saying, with a steadiness that was extraordinary given the circumstances. "Both hands, take the end and hold on." The child grabbed the coat. Miss Colville pulled. Flat, slow, not jerking, a steady, sustained pressure that drew the child forward across the ice's surface, keeping her weight distributed, until she was clear of the water and being dragged toward the bank. My brother was past me before the child reached the edge. He went on to the bank, reached out, and pulled them both in the last yard, Miss Colville and the child together, hand over hand, with the particular decisive strength of a man who is not thinking about anything except the task. The child was wet and shaking and unhurt. Miss Colville sat on the dead grass of the bank and looked at her hands and said nothing for a moment. "Are you all right?" my brother said. He was crouched in front of her, which put him below her eye level, and his face was doing something I had not seen it do in years. She looked at her hands, which were scraped from the ice. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'm fine." She looked past him to the child, who was being wrapped in her older brother's coat. "Is she warm enough?" "We'll get her to the house," I said. "Come, both of you." In the kitchen, over the cook's brandy and the child's hot milk, and the steady, cheerful noise of a crisis that had resolved the right way, my brother sat across the table from Miss Colville and looked at her with an expression I knew, finally, how to name. He had been afraid. Not in the moment. In the moment he had been entirely functional, as he always was, moving to solve the problem at hand. Afterward, he had looked at her scraped hands and felt something that he did not know how to house. She was talking to the child, asking her name, Bess, asking her whether she'd skated before, yes, twice, telling her that the trick was to fall the way cats did, to go flat. The child was listening with the serious attention of 6-year-olds, who are capable of absorbing survival instructions with a focus that adults frequently lack. My brother was watching her, and his face was entirely open, in the way that faces become when the person is not aware that anyone is looking. I picked up my brandy and turned away. He found her in the library that evening. I know this because the library was between my room and the kitchen, and I was hungry at 10 o'clock, and I heard their voices, his, carrying the particular cadence of someone saying something they had not planned to say. Hers, quieter, pausing in ways that suggested thought. I did not stop. I went to the kitchen, ate a very good piece of pie, and came back. The library door was ajar. I paused. "Ought to have looked sooner," he was saying. "The ice I should have." "You couldn't watch the whole lock all morning," she said. "You have an estate to manage. There are 100 things that need watching. One thing today." A pause. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was gentle but direct, "you cannot maintain watch over every possible thing that might go wrong. Children fall through ice sometimes. Today she was lucky. Next time she will know better, and so will her brothers. That is how children learn about ice." A longer pause. "You pulled them both," he said. "Together, you'd have gone in yourself if the ice hadn't held." I was lying flat. The ice held quite well. If it hadn't. She did not answer for a moment. Then I have been trying this past year not to calculate the odds of things going badly before deciding whether to act. It is a poor way to live. The calculation runs on everything eventually, and you find yourself not doing very much. I heard him breathe. Yes, he said quietly, I know something of that. I moved away from the door and went to bed. My grandmother appeared at breakfast the next morning in better spirits than any of us. I have been giving some thought, she said over her eggs, to a small dinner, the Kincaids, the Morven family, perhaps the Penderton cousins. No, not the Penderton cousins, one must draw a line somewhere. She flicked a glance at Miss Colville. The Fife Aldershaws. They have a rather grand house and a rather smaller imagination, but they are county, and county ought to come. Miss Colville looked up. Something moved in her face. Lady Elspeth, you don't need to. I am not doing anything, my grandmother said, with the serenity of a woman who is doing something quite specific. I am having a dinner. I have dinners. It is my house. She returned to her eggs. Saturday week, you will still be here. It was not a question. Miss Colville held her gaze for a moment. Then, if you would like me to be. I would. I looked at my brother. He was looking at the tablecloth with the expression of a man who knows he is being managed and has, somewhere in the last 7 days, ceased to object to it. The week between was different from the first week. My brother stopped trying to find reasons to be elsewhere. This is the most I can say about it, because he was not a demonstrative man, and what shifted in him shifted below the surface, in the way shifts do in stone, not visible until they have already happened. He walked with us. He sat at dinner and let conversations run long. He asked about the music post in Carlisle once, in the walled garden, and she told him what she told my grandmother, that it was probable, that the family was decent, that she had taught piano before and did not find it disagreeable. And he listened to all of it with the particular stillness of a man who is listening to something he intends to disagree with and is working out how. He did not disagree with it then. But he walked back to the house with a set to his jaw that I recognized. On the Wednesday of that week, the three of us walked the lock path in the late afternoon when the light had gone low and gold off the western hills. My grandmother had cried off with her hip, which I did not believe for a moment, and so it was the three of us, which is to say the two of them and myself at an appropriately irrelevant distance. I heard enough. He was asking her about Edinburgh, her brother's situation, the counting house, what the city was like in November. She was answering without elaboration, and then she asked him about the valley, and he told her about the history of the estate with a directness he rarely brought to anything personal, the years of the old Duke, the difficulties of the North Farms, the tenants who had been there 3 generations. He spoke about it the way he spoke about the lock's color at dawn, with a specificity that was itself a form of trust, the sharing of something precise and particular. She walked beside him and listened, and at one point she asked a question that stopped him mid-sentence, a question about the drainage of the eastern fields that was both entirely practical and, I suspected, something she had been turning over in her mind since he'd mentioned it at dinner 2 days prior. He looked at her for a moment with that arrested expression, the one I'd seen over the Clementi, and then answered in full. I dropped further behind and looked at the hills. The sky had gone a deep and purpling gray in the west, the kind of sky that meant hard frost before morning, and the valley was very quiet except for the sound of the river somewhere below us, and the two of them talking ahead of me in voices I could not quite catch. I noticed something on the walk back as the house came into view and my brother held the low gate in the stone wall for her. He said something that made her laugh. Not a social laugh, an actual one, brief and genuine, the sound of amusement taken by surprise. She put her hand to her mouth as though she hadn't expected it. He looked at her for a moment with an expression I had seen on precisely no previous occasion in his adult life. And then he looked away at the house with the expression of a man who is very carefully not examining what he just felt. I had never seen my brother make anyone laugh before. I was not certain he had known he could. She played again in the evenings. He always came in. He would sit in the chair nearest the window, outside her line of sight, and listen with his eyes closed, and I would watch his face ease by degrees, the severity releasing, the jaw unclenching, until he looked in those moments like someone other than the man who stood at the library window in November and said he had no intention of meeting anyone. He looked in those moments like a man who had found somewhere to put down something heavy and was not yet sure whether it was safe to leave it there. She did not look at him when she played, but she knew he was there. I could tell by the way she chose what to play, not the Clementi again, not performances, but things that were quieter and longer, pieces that had room in them, that breathed. On the Thursday before the dinner she stopped mid-piece, turned on the bench and looked at him. "What would you like to hear?" she said. He opened his eyes. The question had caught him off guard, which was rare. "Whatever you find easiest," he said. She considered him for a moment. Then she turned back to the keys and played something I didn't know, a melody so quiet I had to hold still to catch it, simple as a song but not quite a song, repeating with variations as though testing what it was. It had no performance in it at all. It had the quality of thinking aloud, of a mind working through something by feeling its way. She played it through twice and stopped. "What is that?" he said. "Something I wrote," she said, her back to him. "A long time ago. I was 16. A pause. I don't know why I played it. I haven't in years." The silence after that was the kind of silence that has weight. "It's beautiful," he said, and his voice had something in it that I had not heard from him since he was young, not warmth exactly, which he had always been capable of in small doses, but openness. The quality of a door left ajar. She didn't turn around, but she pressed one key softly and held it until the sound faded entirely. I slipped out of the room. Saturday arrived in the way of English winter Saturdays, gray, windless, the valley sealed under a low sky that neither threatened snow nor delivered it but simply pressed down, colorless and impartial. The guests arrived by 4. The Kincaids were a moderate family from the hill farms, solid and pleasant. The Morvan couple were older, connected to our grandmother through 3 shared friendships and a common disapproval of ostentation. The Fife Aldershaws were exactly what she'd said, a grand house and a smaller imagination, the wife particularly, a woman named Cecily Fife Aldershaw who moved through rooms the way some people do, with a permanent awareness of where she stood relative to every other person in it. She deployed her position in them, near the fire, near the Duke, near the best light, with the unconscious expertise of someone who had been doing it so long it had become reflex. It was Cecily Fife Aldershaw who had secured the fiancé. I had not known this until my grandmother told me that morning, with the air of someone sharing administrative information, that Mrs. Fife Aldershaw had been Miss Colville's erstwhile friend, and was also the woman on whose account Mr. Penderton had left the church without completing the ceremony. I had stared at my grandmother. She had poured her tea and said, quite calmly, that she thought it important I be aware of the context. "And you invited her," I said. "County must come," my grandmother said. "You are engineering a confrontation." "I am having a dinner," she said. "What happens at it will depend entirely on your brother." I had looked at her for a long time. "You planned all of this," I said, "from the beginning." She set down her cup. "I planned the introduction," she said. "Everything else has been quite out of my hands." She did not look displeased about this. Miss Colville came down at 6 in a gown of deep blue silk that must have been from before her father's ruin. It fit her too well to be recent, a gown made for her specifically, and the cut of it was such that she wore it with a composure that had nothing to do with the gown and everything to do with the woman. She came down the stairs with the same lack of performance with which she'd come up the drive on the first night, and she saw Mrs. Fife Aldershaw in the entrance hall before Mrs. Fife Aldershaw saw her. I watched her face. It went for 1/2 second, absolutely still. I had not in 2 weeks at Strathvane seen her composure fail even by that margin. Then something resolved in it, a decision, made in the time it takes to breathe in and breathe out, and she walked down the remaining steps and crossed the hall with the steady, unhurried pace of a woman who has already decided that nothing in this room will be given the satisfaction of her flinching. "Cecily," she said. Mrs. Fife Aldershaw turned. Her face performed surprise, then warmth, then, very briefly, a satisfaction so quickly suppressed that I might have imagined it. "Wren, I had no idea you were here. Lady Elspeth was kind enough to invite me." "Of course, how lovely." A pause. "You look well," said in the tone that means, "given everything, you look surprisingly well, which is more than most in your position would manage." The words perfectly calibrated, carrying their freight in the pause before the last word, rather than in anything that could be directly objected to. "Thank you," Miss Colville said pleasantly. "So do you." She moved past and went to find my grandmother. My brother, who had been in the doorway of the drawing-room and had heard all of this, watched Miss Colville walk away with an expression that was entirely unreadable for a moment, and then entirely readable. He looked at Mrs. Fife Aldershaw for 2 seconds, a look without malice but also without any warmth at all, the look of a man cataloging a fact, and then looked away. He had, I thought, assembled his information. The set of his jaw told me he had also formed a conclusion, and that he intended to act on it, and that he had not yet decided in what form. He went into the drawing-room to receive the Kincaids, and I followed him, and we said nothing to each other, and he was entirely civil to everyone for the whole of the hour before dinner in a manner that communicated, at least to me, that he was thinking about something else entirely. At dinner she sat across from Mrs. Fife Aldershaw, beside Mr. Kincaid, who was a decent farmer and an uncomplicated conversationalist, and she was composed through the first 2 removes with the particular steadiness of someone who has chosen, in advance, exactly how they will carry themselves. She spoke with Mr. Kincaid about the autumn farming. She knew enough about it to be genuinely useful in the conversation, not merely polite, and with Mrs. Morven about a novel they had apparently both read, and she ate her dinner with the attentiveness of someone who is not going to let anything that may or may not be coming ruin a well-cooked meal. My brother sat at the head, and he had been watching Mrs. Fife Aldershaw since the entrance hall with the expression that I recognized as the one he wore when he was assembling information. The moment came over the second remove. Mrs. Fife Aldershaw had been speaking of the county's autumn season, the assemblies, the hunt, the general tenor of the social calendar, in the performance style of a woman who is simultaneously entertaining the table and positioning herself within it. She had been, without any single gross violation of form, directing a series of observations that circled Miss Colville the way a bird of prey circles without descending, remarks about the difficulties of keeping up one's social connections when circumstances change, about the particular challenge of re-establishing oneself after what she called, with great apparent sympathy, a public disappointment. Miss Colville had answered each of these in 1 or 2 words, and returned her attention to Mr. Kincaid. Then Mrs. Fife Aldershaw said, with a smile that was entirely social and entirely without mercy, that she did think it remarkable how well some people adapted when their position changed so sharply. "Though I suppose," she added, setting down her fork in a manner designed to signal that what followed was simply an observation, nothing more, when one has never had very much to begin with, the loss is a small pause, that pause itself the cruelty, the comma where the sentence should have ended, the hesitation manufactured to carry maximum weight. Well, less. The table went quiet in the way tables go quiet when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and that everyone present has heard and registered, and is now pretending to process as though it were merely an awkward moment rather than a deliberate wound. Miss Colville's face was still. My brother set down his wine glass. He did not stand. He did not make a speech. He did not look at Mrs. Fife Aldershaw or address the table. He reached across, not far, the table between their settings was not wide, and placed his hand over Miss Colville's where it rested beside her plate, and he left it there. It was a touch of perhaps 5 seconds, still, unhurried, entirely deliberate. His hand over hers before a table of 8 people, in a room where everyone understood exactly what it meant, and what it did not mean for him to do such a thing, the Duke of Strathvane, who touched no one, whose formality was as much a part of the house as the stone walls, whose last public intimacy had been at a broken engagement 8 years ago. No one at that table would misread it. No one at that table did. He did not look at Mrs. Fife Aldershaw. He looked at Miss Colville. And he said, in a voice that was quiet enough that it was intimate and clear enough that every person at that table heard it, "You have more to begin with than any person at this table." Mrs. Fife Aldershaw said nothing. The smile had gone. There was nothing to say that would not make things considerably worse for herself. Mr. Kincaid, who was a farmer and a decent man, picked up his fork and resumed eating, because he was a man who knew when something had been settled, and that the polite response to a settled matter was to allow it to be settled. The Morvins followed. My grandmother, at the far end of the table, lifted her wine glass and took a very small, very satisfied sip. Miss Colville looked down at the hand on hers. Then she looked up at my brother. Her face was the face of a woman who has been carrying a stone for a very long time and has been, entirely without warning, relieved of it. Not by someone taking it from her, not with fanfare or rescue, but simply by a man placing his hand over hers and telling the truth. Her eyes were bright. She did not look away. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady, but only barely. He did not move his hand for another moment. Then he did, and picked up his fork, and addressed a remark to Mr. Morvin about the state of the East Road, and the dinner went on. Mrs. Fife Aldershaw departed early, citing a headache, which was the correct decision. After the guests had gone, my grandmother retired with the air of a general, reviewing a successful campaign. I walked to the library and found for once that I was not needed in it. Through the door left open, I heard my brother's voice and Miss Colville's, low and unhurried, and I did not go in. I went instead to my room and sat by the window and looked at the loch, which lay silver under a cleared sky, the stars very bright over the valley. The frost had come back. By morning the eastern arm would be locked again. I was there for perhaps an hour before I heard footsteps in the passage. Then my brother knocked and came in, which he had not done since we were children. He stood in the middle of my room and looked at the window. "I told her," he said. "What did you tell her?" "That I wanted her to stay." A pause. "That the Carlisle post was not, that it was not what he stopped." He put his hands in his pockets and looked at the floor with the expression of a man who has misplaced a sentence he was in the middle of. "I told her that I thought grandmother had seen something before I had, and that the time it had taken me to see it was not a small thing, and I was aware of it and did not expect. I told her I did not expect her to answer on the basis of one dinner in a fortnight." He was quiet for a moment. "I told her that she played the most beautiful piece of music I had ever heard, and that it was not the Clementi." I looked at him for a long moment. "What did she say?" I said. He looked up. His face in the lamplight was entirely open in a way I had not seen since he was 12 years old. "She said she would think about it," he said. I looked at him for a long moment. "That," I said, "is the best possible answer she could have given you." He thought about this. Then, "Yes," a pause, "yes, I suppose it is." He went back to his room. "She stayed." "Not immediately. She went home for a fortnight, to her brother's lodgings in Edinburgh, to manage what needed managing. She wrote to my grandmother twice, and to me once, a letter about ice and the Clementi sonata that I have kept. She did not write to my brother. He did not expect her to, and this, I think, was the moment he understood her entirely, that she was not a woman who performed consideration, who wrote reassuring letters to manage the feelings of the people waiting. She was actually thinking. He waited the 2 weeks in the particular stillness of a man who has put something important down, and is not yet sure whether it will still be there when he looks. It was. She came back in December on a Tuesday, which I know because I had been counting the days in the way one counts days when something important depends on their passing, and I was not the one waiting. The eastern arm had frozen again, and the sky was the pale white of snow held back. My brother was at the door when the carriage came up the drive. Not waiting, precisely. He was standing with the controlled casualness of a man who has been there for some time, and had good reasons to be there that had, over the course of the wait, become gradually less convincing. She came down from the carriage and saw him. She walked to the steps and stopped. There was between them a silence of the kind that does not need to be filled. That is itself a form of communication between two people who have spent 2 weeks in each other's absence arriving at something they could not quite arrive at in each other's presence. "Miss Colville," he said. "Your Grace." A pause. "I was thinking," he said with some care, "that the eastern arm may be safe enough for skating, if you'd like to see it." She looked at him. The wry thing moved in her face just briefly, that flicker of warmth she kept behind composure, that came out only when she had decided to permit it. "And you'll test it first, with a pole and a stone." "I'll test it first," he said. "Yes." She picked up her bag. "Then I'd like to see it very much." I was at the upstairs window. My grandmother was at the window beside mine, both of us watching them turn together toward the east lawns, the valley white and still around them, their breath white in the December cold. "You planned everything," I said to her. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I planned the introduction," she said. "The rest of it, the ice, the piano, the dinner, the hand on the table, that was all your brother." She paused. "He simply needed to stop being afraid long enough to see what was in front of him." I looked down at the two of them crossing the lawn toward the lock, moving unhurried through the white morning. "And her," I said. My grandmother was quiet for another moment. She watched them reach the gate in the walled garden wall, watched my brother hold it open, watched Miss Colville walk through. "She needed someone who wouldn't ask her to be less than she was," she said. "She's been asked that rather a great deal." She turned from the window. "Pass me my shawl, Callum." I passed her the shawl, and did not say anything more for a long time. They were married in March in the Valley Church, with the hills visible through the high windows. The light came in at an angle that made everything in the church look briefly gilded, the pews, the stone floor, the pale gown she had chosen that was not the blue silk of the dinner but something simpler, made new for a new occasion. It was small, my grandmother, myself, the Kincaids and the Morvanes, and it was dignified as she was, and it was entirely without performance, as she had been from the beginning. I stood at my brother's shoulder and watched him take her hand and say the words, and his voice did not waver once. Those who knew him understood this as the most extraordinary thing, not because he was a man incapable of resolve, but because this was a resolve of a different kind, offered in public without armor, in front of the people who knew him best. She said the words back with her eyes on his face, and when it was done she looked at him with the expression I had first seen at the dinner table, that look of a stone put down, of weight no longer carried. Except that now it was not the shock of the unexpected relief, but simply the fact of being, at last, where she was meant to be. He brought her home to Strathvane through the March afternoon, the hills going green at last after the long winter, the loch glinting at the end of the east lawns where the ice had gone. The valley looked, in that afternoon light, as it had looked in the painting in the upstairs corridor that dated from 130 years ago, as though nothing had changed and nothing needed to. I rode back with my grandmother in the second carriage, and she said very little, which was unusual. I watched the hall appear ahead of us at the end of the valley road and thought about Miss Colville on the first night. The way she had looked at the fire in the entrance hall and not at the portraits, not at the ceilings, not at the size of the thing. She had looked at the warmth. "Are you satisfied?" I asked her. She looked at the hills going past the carriage window for a long time. "She will be happy," she said. "He will be worth something at last." She paused. "That is enough." I thought about everything she had set in motion. The letter in November, the room with the piano, the walks in the walled garden and along the loch, the Saturday dinner with its precise and dangerous guest list. The long game played by a woman of 81 who had watched her grandson be afraid for years, afraid to want anything, afraid to trust anything, afraid in the specific and careful way of a person who has been confirmed in their worst expectations once, and has decided not to provide the world another opportunity, and had finally, in the way of women who have run out of patience with the wrong things, done something about it. "You are a remarkable woman," I said. She turned from the window, and for a moment she looked not 81 and not the Dowager Duchess of Strathvane, but simply a woman who had loved two people and made sure they found their way to each other. "Yes," she said, without a trace of modesty. "I know." The carriage turned into the valley road, and Strathvane Hall rose ahead of us in the March light, its gray stone turned almost golden by the afternoon, and inside it my brother and his wife were setting down their coats. The hall was warm. Neither of them were going anywhere. That is the whole of it. I have told it as accurately as I can, which is to say I have left out the parts that were not mine to know and included everything I saw. I was there for all of it, and I can tell you that I have witnessed, in my years, a great many things presented as love that were no such thing. What I saw between my brother and Wren Colville was the true article, arrived at the hard way, past fear and pride, and the accumulated weight of every assessment that had told both of them to expect less. My grandmother had opened a door. They had walked through it, each under their own power, each carrying what they were carrying, and they had found on the other side not rescue and not transformation but something quieter and more durable, the plain fact of being seen by someone who did not look away. She had not rescued him from himself. He had not rescued her from her circumstances. They had, with enormous patience and very little fanfare, simply chosen each other. In a world that had told both of them what they were worth, that choosing was everything. He was, in the end, worth something at last. She was, in the end, given what she had always deserved, not given it by anyone else, but given the space in which to receive it, which is a different thing and a more important one. That, it seems to me, is how the best things happen, not in spite of the fear, not around it, straight through it at the pace of a woman crossing a frozen loch to reach a child, keeping flat to the ice, holding steady, pulling.